When a combat veteran struggling with PTSD decided to destroy an ancient termite mound on his land, he was just thinking about saving his ranch from the bank. But the moment he started the bulldozer, Coda, his loyal therapy dog, changed completely. The dog trained to bring peace was now barking wildly, lunging between the machine and the mound, desperately clawing at a single spot in the dirt. Garrett froze. His dog was not barking at a snake. He was not barking at a rabbit. He was barking at the ground itself. And when Garrett's shovel finally struck metal, the sound that came back was not the flat thud of a rock. It was a deep, hollow clang, the unmistakable ring of something massive and man-made buried beneath his feet. He dropped to his knees and began scraping away 60 years of caked earth. Beneath the dirt, faded but absolutely unmistakable, was the winged star of the United States Air Force. And below it, stenciled in pale blue paint, that time had nearly erased two words that would tear his entire world apart. Project Stillwater, 1968. The high desert sun of Otero County, New Mexico was a merciless white eye. It had watched the land bake for more than 200 days without a single meaningful drop of rain. The Hale Ranch, once a modest spread of struggling grassland, was now just a cracked, brown canvas of dust in the brittle skeletons of yucca plants. Everything that had once been green was now the color of bone. Garrett Hale stood on the warped planks of his front porch. A ceramic mug of cold coffee sat untouched in his right hand. He did not remember pouring it. He did not remember walking to the porch. He was simply there the way a fence post is there standing, because nothing had knocked it over yet. He was 54 years old, built tall and lean, with the quiet, economical movements of a man who had spent decades working the land and several hard years before that working in war. His brown hair had grown a little too long, streaked with silver at the temples. His face was weathered and angular, carved by the sun and by memories just as harsh. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes and along his jaw, the kind of lines that come not from smiling, but from squinting into bright distances and clenching against things that cannot be unsaid. Yet his blue eyes held a deep, settled kindness, the kind that survives only because it has been tested. He was a former Army Ranger, 75th Ranger Regiment. He had enlisted in 1993 at 19, full of fire and certainty. He had served through Kosovo and then Afghanistan after September 11th. Operation Anaconda in the Shahikat Valley, March of 2002. That was where the fire went out and something else took its place. He never talked about it. Not to the VA doctors, not to his wife before she passed, not to anyone. But it lived in him in the way he flinched at unexpected loud sounds, in the way he scanned every room before he entered it, in the way he woke at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, his hand reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. He had gotten rid of every weapon in the house years ago. The VA counselor had recommended it, and Garrett had agreed not because he feared what the guns could do to others, but because he feared what they might do to him on a bad night. The empty gun safe in the closet was one of the truest things he had ever done. He was discharged in 2004 with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. He came home to this ranch, the land his grandfather had homesteaded, the land where his mother had raised him alone then after his father died. And he had tried with everything he had to build a quiet life on this quiet ground. He married Sarah, a gentle woman who understood silence and did not fear it. She stood beside him through the worst years, the rage that erupted without warning, the nights he could not sleep, the mornings he stared through her as though she were made of glass. Sarah died of cancer 8 years ago. After that, Garrett nearly came apart entirely. A low, anxious whine sounded at his side. A cold, damp nose pushed insistently into his palm. Garrett looked down. Coda, a 7-year-old German shepherd, 90 pounds of muscle and loyalty, with a coat that was a striking mix of snow white and deep charcoal gray. Thick and powerful, he looked like a winter wolf displaced in the desert. His ears were large and expressive, and his eyes were the color of dark amber. intelligent and watchful in a way that sometimes made Garrett forget he was looking at an animal. Coda had been rescued from a shelter in Alamogordo, a dog that had been abandoned starved down to his ribs with matted fur and a deep wariness of human hands. But from the first moment Garrett knelt in front of that kennel, something passed between them. Recognition. Two broken creatures who understood damage. Coda was trained and certified as a PTSD service animal. He could read the storms that gathered behind Garrett's eyes before Garrett himself knew they were coming. The shallowing breath, the tightening jaw, the 1,000-yard stare that meant Garrett was no longer standing on his porch in New Mexico, but was back in a cold mountain valley in Afghanistan, the air thick with gunpowder and the streams of men he could not save. Coda's job was to bring him back. A cold nose against his palm, a low, persistent whine, the full weight of his body leaning into Garrett's leg like a living anchor. This morning on the porch, Garrett's hand had been clenched into a fist without his knowing it. Clenched at the sight of his dead pasture, his empty cattle pens, his cracked earth. Coda pushed his muzzle into that fist, and slowly, under the steady pressure of the dog's attention, Garrett's fingers uncurled. He looked through the screen door into the kitchen. On the battered pine table lay a single white envelope, stark and official. It was the third one that month from the bank. He did not need to open it. He knew the polite, merciless language of foreclosure by heart. The signature at the bottom belonged to Lorraine Marsh, a senior loan officer he had never met whose name on paper hit him like a hammer every time he saw it. The drought had choked the life from this ranch. His remaining cattle were gaunt and listless. The grass was gone. The well was nearly dry. The bank was simply waiting for the dust to settle before claiming the bones. "We are running out of time," Coda Garrett murmured. He set the mug down on the porch railing. The coffee was stone cold. Coda whined again, a low thrum of shared anxiety, and leaned his full weight against Garrett's leg. Garrett's eyes scanned the property, past the empty pens, past the dry trough with its ring of salt crust, past the weathered barn, all the way to the north pasture, the part of the ranch he truly avoided. In its center, rising from the flatlands like a forgotten monument, stood the thing the locals called the Petrified Mound. It was massive, taller than his two-bedroom ranch house and wider than his barn, a dense reddish-gray anomaly of hardened fossilized clay and stone that jutted from the earth like a broken tooth. It had been there longer than anyone could remember. It appeared on old Spanish colonial maps. The Mescalero Apache, whose ancestral lands these had once been, were said to have avoided the area entirely, calling it a place where the ground held its breath. Garrett's grandfather had always said the mound was bad luck, a place where something old had gone wrong, and the land had never forgiven it. Garrett did not believe in bad luck, but he believed in geology. The ground for 100 yards around the mound was exceptionally dead, as though the structure itself leached life from the soil. Nothing grew near it, no grass, no scrub. Even the insects seemed to avoid it. But Garrett held a desperate practical theory. He believed that such a massive permanent structure could only have formed and survived in this arid landscape if it sat atop a stable deep water source. An untapped spring perhaps fed by the Sacramento Mountains to the east. A spring that the drought had not yet managed to kill. Water was the only asset that mattered now. If he could find water, he could save the ranch. He could drill a well. He could irrigate. He could offer Lorraine Marsh something other than dust. He had mentioned the idea to his neighbor Earl Navarro at the feed store in Tularosa the week before. Earl was a stout man with a sun-ravaged face and a dusty cap pulled low over his dark eyes. His family had been in the Tularosa Basin for 4 generations, and he knew the land the way a doctor knows a patient. Earl had shaken his head slowly. "You are chasing ghosts, Garrett. That thing is older than sin. My grandfather tried to blast it back in '73. Did not even scratch it. You will break your dozer before you break that mound. Best to just let it be." But Garrett could not let it be. Lorraine Marsh would not let him let it be. Today, he would move the unmovable. The sun was a searing smear of orange and purple against the western horizon by the time Garrett engaged the tracks. The old yellow bulldozer, a relic from the 1980s that he had bought at a county auction years ago, coughed a plume of black smoke into the still air and groaned as it lurched forward. The air filled with the sharp smell of diesel fuel and hot, dry metal. Coda watched from a safe distance near the ranch truck. He sat perfectly still, a statue of fur and vigilance against the brown dirt. His ears were straight up, his eyes tracking every movement of the machine. He did not like the bulldozer. He never had. The vibration unsettled him. But he stayed because staying was what he did. Garrett approached the mound at a crawl. He lowered the heavy steel blade until it hovered just above the packed earth at the mound's base. He pushed the throttle forward. The sound was terrible. A high-pitched grinding shriek shuddered through the air as steel met the rock-hard surface of the mound. The bulldozer bucked violently, the track spinning and spitting dust. The blade screeched across the surface, shaving off a few chips of gray clay that were hard as concrete. Sparks flew where metal scraped against embedded stone. It was exactly like trying to push a mountain. Garrett gritted his teeth. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging. He backed the machine up the tracks, clanking, and took a breath. He throttled forward again, hitting the mound with more force. The impact sent a heavy jolt up through the seat and into his spine. The engine roared and strained the temperature gauge, climbing. But the mound did not yield. It simply sat there, ancient and indifferent, as though a man and his machine were of no more consequence than the wind. Frustration, hot and familiar, began to rise in his chest. He knew this feeling. It was the feeling that came before the darkness, the tightening, the narrowing. He backed up, again angrier, now jaw clenched, ready to slam the machine into the unyielding wall with everything the old engine had left. And then a sound cut through the diesel roar that stopped him cold. Barking, frantic, piercing, desperate barking. It was not Coda's usual alert bark. That bark was sharp and controlled a single note meant to say, "Pay attention." This was different. This was alarm. This was panic. This was a sound Garrett had never heard from his dog in 7 years together. Garrett yanked the throttle back. The engine dropped to a rough rumbling idle. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove and looked to his left. Coda was no longer by the truck. The dog was at the base of the mound, about 20 yards from the bulldozer, in a state of total frenzy. He was running in tight, agitated circles around one specific spot on the ground. He would stop, bark at the dirt, and then begin digging furiously with his powerful front paws, sending clumps of dry earth flying behind him in arcs. Then he would let out a high-pitched whine, dig again, stop, look back at Garrett, and bark with a sharp, desperate urgency that sent a chill straight through Garrett's sweat-soaked shirt and into his bones, Coda heel. Garrett commanded, his voice carrying over the engine's idle. The dog ignored him completely. He kept digging, kept barking, kept circling that one spot. Garrett watched for 10 seconds. His frustration paused, replaced by something older and sharper. He had lived with this dog every day for 7 years. He knew Coda's behavior for rabbits, focused and eager. He knew his behavior for rattlesnakes, still rigid, a single low growl. This was neither of those. This was something else entirely. The dog's behavior was so erratic, so completely out of character, that it bypassed Garrett's anger and triggered the instinct that had kept him alive in places where anger got men killed. Something was wrong. He pulled the heavy lever, disengaging the hydraulics. The massive steel blade dropped to the ground with a dull, heavy thud that Garrett felt through the soles of his boots. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense. The vast, indifferent quiet of the high desert rushed in to fill the space broken only by the sound of Coda's frantic digging and his sharp, insistent barks. Garrett swung himself down from the cab. His boots hit the packed dirt. He walked toward his dog, his eyes fixed on the patch of dead earth that had consumed Coda's attention. The air was cooling fast now, the sun nearly gone, and the shadows from the mound stretched long and dark across the ground like fingers. Coda had stopped barking, but he remained fixated on the spot he had torn open his body, rigid, his ears flat against his skull. He looked up at Garrett with something Garrett could only describe as urgent confusion, and then he looked back at the hole and whined low and continuous in his throat. "Easy, boy," Garrett said quietly. His voice sounded small in the open air. "What is it? What has got you so spooked?" Trusting the dog's instincts, which had never once failed him, Garrett walked back to the bulldozer and unhooked the heavy steel shovel he kept strapped to the side. He returned to the spot. The sun's last light was a thin line of gold along the western ridge, casting long purple shadows across the hard-packed earth. He jammed the shovel tip into the ground where Coda had been digging. The soil was dense, almost like concrete mixed with the same fossilized clay that made up the mound itself. He put his boot on the shovel's shoulder and drove it deep with his fullest weight. The blade sank about 4 inches and stopped. He dug. For several minutes, the only sound in the dying light was the rhythmic scrape and grunt of his labor. The dirt was reddish and dry, and it came up in heavy clumps that he tossed to the side. Coda watched, pacing in a tight circle next to the growing hole, his body wound tight as a coiled spring. The shovel bit into the soil again, and then it hit something. The impact traveled up the wooden handle and into Garrett's hands and arms, with a heavy metallic resonance that he felt in his teeth. He froze. The vibration was wrong. It was not the dull, flat thud of hitting a buried rock. It was a deep, hollow clang, the sound of metal striking metal. Garrett scraped the shovel tip across the object, clearing more dirt. A harsh grating sound filled the quiet. His heart, which had been pounding steadily from the physical labor, shifted to a different rhythm. Slower, heavier. The drumbeat of something he did not yet have a name for. Back, Coda. Back. He worked faster, no longer digging deep but scraping wide, clearing the surface. Coda moved to the opposite side of the growing hole and began digging with his own paws. Powerful strokes that sent arcs of dirt flying, man and dog working together against the packed earth, fighting the stubborn grip of 6 decades. An edge appeared, then a corner, then a flat, dark surface of pitted, rusted iron. 20 more minutes of hard, breathless work. The last light was gone, now replaced by the cold blue glow of early starlight. Garrett stood back, breathing hard, his hands tingling, his shirt soaked through. It was a hatch, a perfect, heavy-duty square of steel, roughly 4 feet by 4 feet, set flush into the earth. The metal was far thicker than anything a civilian would use for a water tank or a septic system. Heavy oxidized rivets studded its perimeter in precise rows, and in the center sat a massive recessed ring pull handle, thick as Garrett's wrist, green with corrosion. He knelt beside it, his knee cracked in the cold air. This was not a farmer's cellar. This was not a rancher's storm shelter. The construction was too precise, too heavy, too deliberate. His hand, covered in a worn leather work glove, moved to the center of the hatch. He began to rub away the decades of caked, sun-baked grime that covered the steel. The dirt was like cement fused to the metal by years of heat and pressure, but he scraped at it with his fingernails, and the edge of the shovel working by feel in the dimming light. A shape began to emerge beneath his fingers, faded pale blue paint under the rust. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. It was the wing star insignia of the United States Air Force, faded and corroded but unmistakable to anyone who had ever worn a uniform. A cold wave washed through him, sharp and acidic, completely overriding the desert chill. This was his land. It had been his father's land, and his grandfather's before that. What was an Air Force installation doing buried here? He rubbed more frantically at the surface below the insignia, his glove scraping against metal. Stenciled letters, stark and military issue, appeared one by one beneath his hand. He read them aloud. His voice sounded strange and hollow in the open air. Project Stillwater. He scraped lower, his pulse thudding in his ears. 1968. And below that, one final line that made the blood in his veins run cold. Unauthorized entry prohibited. Garrett sat back on his heels. The stars were coming out overhead, sharp and indifferent. The desert was cooling rapidly, and he could see his own breath in the air, now thin white clouds that vanished as soon as they appeared. As a former Army Ranger, he had seen secure installations. He knew the look of military specification hardware, the precise welds, the non-commercial rivets, the sheer unnecessary thickness of the steel. This was not just a bunker, it was a high-security containment structure. It was designed to keep people out. Or he thought with a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature to keep something in. 1968, the year his father would have been 35. A young engineer working at Holloman Air Force Base just over the Sacramento Ridge. An engineer who was proud of his work but never spoke of it, because it was classified. Douglas Hale had died in 1973. A sudden, massive heart attack, the doctors had said. Too much stress. He was only 45. Garrett had not yet been a year old. He had no memory of his father at all. Not a voice, not a face, not a touch. Only photographs and a story his mother told about how Douglas always smelled of graphite and coffee. She had kept one of his old jackets in the back of the bedroom closet for years, unable to throw it away. And when Garrett was a boy, he would sometimes open the closet and press his face into the fabric, trying to find some trace of the man who had worn it. The scent was long gone by then, but the searching never stopped. Now kneeling in the dirt beside a buried military hatch on his own land, with the stars burning overhead and his dog pressed against his side, Garrett felt a connection form in his mind. A cold, heavy link between two things he had never thought to connect. His father's secret work, and this secret buried beneath the earth that his father had walked every day. The wind began to pick up from the west. Garrett looked at the horizon. The sky above the mountains was no longer clear. A solid churning wall of brown was building, blotting out the lowest stars, a dust storm rolling in fast across the basin. He looked down at the heavy ring handle on the hatch. He had to know what was beneath it, but not like this, not with a storm coming, not with the light gone, not without knowing what he was walking into. Whatever Project Stillwater was, it had waited 60 years. It could wait one more night. "Come on, Coda," he said. His voice was rough. "Let us go home." He grabbed the shovel and, with Coda pressed close to his leg, walked back toward the small house. The first gust of sand-laden wind hit them before they reached the porch, stinging and cold. Behind them, in the darkness of the north pasture, the buried hatch lay exposed to the stars, patient and silent, holding its breath, the way the land around it had always held its breath. Garrett did not sleep. The wind howled against the small house for hours, a high, thin shriek that sounded like something alive and in pain. Fine silt pushed its way under the door and through the window frames, coating every surface in a layer of brown dust that would take days to clean. He sat in his old armchair in the dark living room, the storm outside and the real storm inside his head. Coda lay at his feet, not sleeping either. The dog's eyes caught the faint light from the kitchen clock, 2 points of watchful stillness in the darkness. Project Stillwater, 1968. The words would not leave him. He had spent 20 years trying to bury his own past, his own service, the things he had seen and done in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now it seemed the past had literally been unearthed in his own backyard. And this past was not even his. It belonged to the father he had never known. The quiet engineer who smelled of graphite and coffee, the man who went to work at a military base every morning and came home every evening and never ever spoke about what he did there. Douglas Hale, safety engineer, dead at 45 of a heart attack. Too much stress. Garrett stared at the wall. The wind screamed, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if that had been a lie. Coda shifted at his feet, resting his heavy head on Garrett's boot. The warmth of the dog's body, the slow rhythm of his breathing, was the only thing that felt real in the dark room. "What did you bury out there, Dad?" Garrett whispered into the darkness. The search for water was over. A different search, far more dangerous, had just begun. He would wait for the storm to pass. And then in the morning, he would open the hatch and find out what his father had spent his life protecting or hiding. Outside, the wind howled on and the dust covered everything. The dawn broke clear and cold, as though the dust storm had scoured the sky down to bare metal, leaving it a pale, hard blue that offered no warmth and no comfort. The world was coated in a fine brown powder, a fresh skin of dust over the old dust, and the air smelled of dry earth and ozone. Garrett Hale did not wait for the sun to bring warmth. He had been awake all night, sitting in the dark with the name Project Stillwater turning over and over in his mind like a stone in a tumbler, each rotation wearing away another layer of the life he thought he understood. He pulled on his heavy work boots, his movements stiff and deliberate, the way a man moves when he has made a decision that frightens him but cannot be taken back. Coda was already at the door. The dog's body language was a sharp contrast to his usual morning energy. There was no tail wagging, no playful nudging for breakfast, no trotting to his bowl in the kitchen. Coda stood rigid at the screen door, his ears pointed forward, his gaze fixed on something beyond the glass, as though he could already smell the secret from across the yard. His body was a drawn bow, every muscle still, every sense aimed outward. "I know, boy," Garrett said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet kitchen. I have to know." He went to the barn. The cold air stung his lungs and he could see his breath in short white bursts. He gathered his tools with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for a mission, selecting each one with a specific purpose in mind. A 6-foot steel pry bar for the locking mechanism, a small sledgehammer to break the rust, a heavy-duty climbing rope he normally used for mending the old windmill, 60 feet of braided nylon rated to hold 400 pounds, and a high-powered battery-operated flashlight, the kind that threw a beam bright enough to read by at 200 yards. He loaded the tools into the bed of his truck and drove to the north pasture. The morning light was thin and sharp, turning the dust-covered landscape into something that looked like the surface of another planet. When he reached the site, Coda was already there. The dog had run ahead, cutting across the open ground with the swift, low gait of a working animal on a mission. But he was not at the hatch. He stood near the silent bulldozer, a sentinel watching the exposed square of steel from a distance of about 30 feet. He would not go closer. Garrett walked to the edge of the hole and looked down. The hatch sat in the hard-packed earth, the stenciled Air Force insignia, and the words Project Stillwater, looking even more stark in the sharp morning light. The faded blue paint, the heavy rivets, the corroded ring handle. In daylight, the thing looked less like a relic and more like a warning. Something about the way it was built, the sheer over-engineered weight of it, spoke of people who had been very serious about keeping this sealed. The locking mechanism was a recessed steel wheel, like something from a submarine about 18 inches in diameter. It was rusted into a solid block, the spokes of the wheel fused to the housing by 60 years of subterranean silence and mineral deposits. Garrett wedged the tip of the pry bar into one of the spokes and threw his entire weight against it. The bar did not move, not a fraction of an inch. The metal was welded shut by time itself. "All right," he muttered. He set the pry bar again, positioned it carefully for maximum leverage, and lifted the sledgehammer with his other hand. The first blow rang out across the empty pasture, a sharp percussive clang that seemed to punch a hole in the desert quiet. Birds he had not noticed, small brown sparrows sheltering in the scrub, burst into the air and scattered. He struck the bar again and again. Each blow sent a shock up through his arms and into his shoulders. On the fifth strike, with a final desperate heave on the pry bar, a sound like a bone snapping echoed from the mechanism, a sharp, wrenching crack of old metal giving way. The wheel turned, just an inch, with a groan of rusted agony that sounded almost human. And then it began. A loud, sustained hissing sound erupted from the entire perimeter of the hatch. It came from every edge at once, a violent rush of air that made Garrett stumble backward. It was the sound of a tomb exhaling. 60 years of pressure differential equalizing in a single gasping rush. A brittle black rubber gasket, which had maintained an airtight seal for 6 decades, cracked and tore and disintegrated, releasing the vacuum with a sound like a massive ancient lung taking its first breath in half a century. For Garrett, it was physics, the sound of an old seal breaking. He did not know, could not know, that this simple mechanical event had just tripped something else entirely. Buried in the wall of the shaft below, encased in a lead-lined housing, a tiny device powered by a decaying core of radioactive material, a radioisotope thermoelectric generator no larger than a coffee can, had been waiting for this exact moment. The break in the pressure seal completed a circuit that had been open since 1968. A low-frequency electromagnetic pulse, weak but persistent, began to transmit. Its signal traveled outward through the rock, in the soil, in the dry desert air, moving at the speed of light toward a receiver that no one alive remembered existed. The air rushed out of the hatch, and the smell hit them. Coda yelped, not barked, yelped, a sharp, pained sound as though something had struck him. The dog scrambled backward, his claws tearing at the hard dirt, and he began to bark. Not the confused, frantic barking from the day before. This was deeper. This came from the bottom of his chest, from a place that was older than training, older than domestication. This was the bark of a wolf warning its pack that something unnatural was near. Garrett flinched and covered his nose and mouth with his forearm. The smell was not decay. It was not the sweet, thick smell of death that he knew from the mountains. This was something else, sharp and sterile, chemical, the sting of ozone mixed with the flat, dead smell of old mold. And underneath it all, something deeply metallic, like the smell of overheated machinery, of oil that had been sealed in darkness and slowly broken down into something acrid and wrong. It was the smell of a machine that had been left to rot in the dark for 60 years. Easy, Coda. Easy. It is just stale air, Garrett called over the barking, but his own voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to himself. Coda would not be easy. He paced at a distance of about 20 feet, his head low, his ears flat against his skull, barking a continuous, deep-chested warning at the open hole. Every few seconds he would stop barking and whine instead, a high, thin sound of distress, and then the barking would start again. He was caught between his training, which told him to stay close to Garrett, and his instinct, which told him to run. Garrett grabbed the thick ring handle and pulled. The hatch was heavier than he expected, at least 200 pounds of solid steel, and it scraped loudly across the dirt as he dragged it open, leaving a shallow furrow in the earth. Beneath it was a square of perfect, absolute blackness. Not dark, black. The kind of black that swallowed light and gave nothing back. A steel ladder was bolted to the near wall of the shaft, its rungs disappearing into the dark after about 4 feet. Beyond that, nothing. Just the black and the chemical smell pouring out of it, and the faint, barely audible sound of air, moving in a space that should have been completely still. Garrett looked at Coda. The dog had stopped barking and was staring at him, trembling visibly, his eyes wide. "Watch my back, boy. Stay." Coda whined, a high, thin sound of protest that sounded almost like a word. But he sat. Trembling, his eyes locked on Garrett, but he sat. Garrett secured one end of the climbing rope to the bulldozer's blade, a solid anchor point that was not going anywhere. He clipped the flashlight to his belt. He tested the rope's knot twice, pulling it hard enough to lift his own weight off the ground. It held. He swung his legs over the edge of the hatch and found the first rung of the ladder with his boot. The metal was cold and slick, coated with a fine, oily film of rust that made his fingers slip inside his gloves. He began to climb down. The light of the world disappeared faster than he expected. By the 5th rung, the square of blue sky above him had shrunk to the size of a window. By the 10th, it was a postage stamp. The air grew colder with each step down and damper, and the chemical smell thickened until it coated the inside of his throat and he could taste it on his tongue. A taste like licking a battery. 15 feet down. His arms were shaking not from the effort, but from the cold and from something else, a tightness in his chest that he recognized with a sick, familiar dread. His boots hit a solid surface, metal plating. He was standing on a floor. He unclipped the flashlight and pressed the switch. The beam cut a sharp white cone through the absolute darkness. He was in a small square room no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were riveted steel panels painted in what had once been institutional gray, but was now a landscape of peeling, bubbling paint and dark stains where moisture had crept through over the decades. Thick cables and insulated pipes ran along the ceiling, some sagging, some broken, their contents long since dried or evaporated. The floor was steel plating, and it was covered in a thin layer of fine dust that had sifted down from above over 60 years. His boot prints were the first marks in it. No one had stood in this room since the year it was sealed. And in the far wall directly ahead of him, the flashlight beam found it. A narrow opening roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, framed in riveted steel. A doorway. Beyond it, a corridor stretching away into darkness deeper than the flashlight could reach. The sight hit Garrett like a physical blow. His vision tunneled. The edges of the room went soft and gray. The cold steel walls contracted. The chemical smell became the smell of gunpowder and sweat and blood, and the dark corridor ahead of him was no longer a corridor. It was a cave mouth. Shahi Kot, March 2002. The air was thick and hot. The man in front of him was whispering, motioning him forward into the dark opening in the rock face. Above them, the mountain, thousands of tons of stone and ice pressing down. The sound of gunfire echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system, flat and percussive, impossible to locate. And the fear, the specific, paralyzing, suffocating fear that the rocks would shift, that the ceiling would come down, that he would be buried alive in the dark, 10,000 miles from home. His breath hitched. His chest seized. He could not get air. The flashlight beam was shaking violently, dancing across the peeling paint and the rusted pipes like a strobe light. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, and it sounded like the breathing of a man who was drowning. Get out now. It is a trap. The walls are closing. Garrett's back slammed against the cold steel wall of the bunker. His free hands scrambled for the rope he had left hanging from the ladder. His fingers were numb and clumsy, and he could not find it. The panic was total. A living thing with weight and teeth sitting on his chest, squeezing. And then, from far above him, muffled but absolutely clear, cutting through the darkness and the panic and the ghosts, he heard it. Barking. Frantic, continuous, desperate barking. And beneath the barking, a sound that was even more urgent. A rhythmic, metallic scraping. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound of heavy claws on steel. Coda. The dog was not just barking a warning. Coda knew. Through some bond that went deeper than training, deeper than scent, deeper than anything Garrett could explain, the dog knew that his owner was in distress 30 feet below the ground. And he was trying to dig his way down through the steel hatch, trying to reach him. The sound of those claws cut through the flashback like a blade through smoke. Coda is up there. I am in New Mexico. I am on my ranch. The year is 2028. The war is over. Garrett sucked in a shuddering, painful breath of the chemical air. It burned his throat and he coughed, but the cough was real and present, and it anchored him to his own body. I am okay, boy, he choked out. His voice was a hollow echo in the small metal room. I am okay. He pushed himself off the wall. His legs were shaking so badly he had to lock his knees to stay upright. He wanted to climb the ladder and never come back. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to get out of this hole. But he forced himself to stand still. Breathe. 1 breath. 2. 3. The beam of the flashlight steadied by fractions. He forced himself to scan the room. Focus on the task. 1 minute and then you get out. The trembling flashlight beam found a metal shelf bolted to the wall opposite the corridor. On the shelf sat several objects coated in dust and mildew. He stepped forward, his boots loud on the steel floor. A thick leather-bound book, its cover warped and stiff-smelling of chemical mold. He grabbed it. A technical ledger of some kind, filled with handwritten entries. Beside it sat a yellow boxy device with a carrying handle and a large analog meter on its face. It took him a moment to recognize it. A Geiger counter, a radiation detector from the 1960s. He looked at the meter. The needle behind its cracked glass face was not at zero. It sat slightly above the lowest mark, making small, lazy movements. And in the sudden silence, holding his own breath, he heard it, coming from the device. A faint, slow rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Soft, unhurried, patient, like a clock counting down to something that had already happened. It was not screaming. The radiation was not at a dangerous level, at least not here, not in this upper room, but it was there. It should not have been there. On the floor beneath the shelf sat one more object, a small gray metal box about the size of a military ammunition can from the 1960s. Its latch was stiff but not locked. Garrett snagged the handle. From above, a clatter. Coda's claws had slipped on the steel hatch. The barking was higher now, frantic with a new edge of desperation. The dog was starting to panic. Enough. Get out. Get out now. Garrett shoved the small box and the leather ledger under his left arm and grabbed the Geiger counter with his free hand. He moved to the ladder. His boots rang loudly on the rungs as he climbed. One hand pulling him up, the other clutching the artifacts against his chest. His lungs burned, his arms shook. The square of blue sky above him grew from a coin to a window to a door. He burst out of the hatch like a man surfacing from deep water, scrambling onto the dusty ground, collapsing onto his hands and knees, gulping the clean, sharp, beautiful desert air in great, desperate mouthfuls. The sun hit his face and he closed his eyes against it, feeling its warmth like a benediction. Coda was on him in an instant, 90 pounds of relief and devotion. The dog was whining in short, high-pitched yelps, licking his face, his ears, his neck, nudging him with his cold nose, pressing his body against Garrett's, with a trembling urgency that was not quite panic and not quite joy, but something raw and overwhelming in between. I am okay, boy. I am okay. Garrett dropped the items in the dust and wrapped both arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the warm fur, breathing in the smell of dust and dough and sunlight and everything that was alive and real and above ground. He held on like a drowning man holds a rope. I am okay. You are a good boy. You brought me back. He sat there for a long time. The sun climbed, the air warmed. Only when his hands stopped shaking did he finally release the dog and turn his attention to the three objects he had carried up from the dark. The sun had set by the time Garrett sealed the hatch, sliding the heavy steel cover back into place with a grating shriek. He drove the bulldozer over it, positioning the heavy blade directly above the ring handle. Not a perfect hiding spot, but it would have to do. Inside his kitchen, under the bright overhead light, the three artifacts sat on his clean pine table, looking alien and wrong, like objects from a different world that had no business being in a place where a man ate his breakfast and drank his morning coffee. The yellow Geiger counter sat by the sink. Its faint, slow ticking was a soft, unnerving metronome in the quiet room. Tick, 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 low level, but not zero, not natural background radiation. The small gray ammunition box was latched shut. He opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in a molded foam insert that had turned brittle and yellow, were 3 reels of magnetic audio tape. Each plastic reel case was stamped with the same military-style stencil. Project Stillwater, followed by dates from October 1968. He had no machine to play them on. Not yet. He turned his attention to the ledger. Its leather cover was stiff and warped dark with water stains, and it smelled of the same chemical mold that had triggered his panic underground. He opened it carefully, the spine cracking. The pages were thick, high-quality stock, the kind used for official records meant to last. They were filled with rows of meticulous handwriting in faded blue ink, not a diary, not personal notes. This was a technical operations log. Garrett's military background helped him parse some of the jargon, but the content was dense and specialized. Columns detailed geological stress test results, sub-level 3 containment integrity measurements, seismic variance readings, atmospheric pressure differentials at various depths. There were dates, times, and initials next to each entry. He saw his father's initials, DH, next to dozens of entries spanning months. Most of the early entries were routine, pressure steady, sensors nominal. Containment integrity 100%. The handwriting was calm and even the notations of a careful man doing careful work. But as Garrett turned the pages deeper into the summer of 1968, the entries changed. The handwriting grew tighter. The notes grew longer. The tone shifted from clinical observation to something that looked on paper like controlled alarm. July 17, 1968, DH test for alpha conducted at OCO 900. Pressure variance noted in sectors 7 through 12. Sensor 09 non-responsive. Recommended diagnostic before proceeding. July 19, 1968. DH containment integrity reading 95%. 2.7% drop in 48 hours, outside acceptable parameters. Recommending immediate halt to all subsurface testing pending full structural review. July 20th, 1968. The handwriting changed. Different hand, different initials. Not DH. The entry read, DH temporarily relieved of monitoring duties per directive. Test 4, Bravo authorized and scheduled for 0600 July 21st. They had removed his father from the project and pushed forward with the next test. July 22nd, 1968. A single word at the top of the page in large capital letters. Anomaly. Then in cramped, hurried writing. All sensors non-responsive. Sublevel 3, sealed by automatic protocol. Full site lockdown ordered. The final entry in the ledger was dated 2 days later, July 24th. It was scrawled in a hand that was barely legible, the pen pressing so hard it had nearly torn the paper. A handwriting in panic or in the dark or both. Site B, lockdown permanent. Level 1 entry sealed. Personnel evacuated. This is over. This is done. Do not unseal. Garrett stared at the page. The kitchen light hummed overhead. Coda lay by the back door, his head on his paws, watching Garrett with steady, patient eyes. The dog's tail gave a single slow thump against the floor. Garrett closed the book. The musty smell rose from its pages. He felt something vast and heavy settle onto his shoulders. A profound, weary sadness for a man he had never known. Douglas Hale had tried to stop it. He had seen the danger documented. It recommended halting the tests. And they had pushed him aside and relieved him of duty, called him unstable, and gone ahead anyway. And then something had gone terribly wrong. And then his father had died. Far away in a windowless, climate-controlled room, in a facility whose address did not appear on any public record, located in the Virginia suburbs, outside Washington, D.C., a monitoring system that had been built during the Johnson administration and forgotten by every administration since received a signal it had not received in 60 years. A red indicator light, one among hundreds on a wall-mounted board covered in dust, began to blink. The system logged the event automatically. Seal breach. Site B, Otero County, New Mexico. Within minutes, an automated alert was routed through a series of legacy communication protocols to a private military contractor. The contractor's name on the very few documents where it appeared was Cerberus Ridge Logistics. Their stated business was defense logistics support. Their actual business was the management and disposal of old, erased government liabilities. The kind of liabilities that were not supposed to exist anymore. They maintained a rapid response team with access to a private aircraft capable of reaching any location in the continental United States within 6 hours. Garrett, oblivious to all of this, turned off the kitchen light and sank into his old armchair. Coda left his spot by the door and curled up on the rug at his feet, pressing his warm body against Garrett's legs. The house was silent. The faint tick of the Geiger counter in the kitchen was the only sound, a tiny radioactive heartbeat in the dark. Garrett closed his eyes. He must have dozed because the next thing he knew, the room had changed. He did not know what woke him. There was no sound. That was the wrong thing to think. He corrected himself. There was a sound. The sound was the absence of Coda's breathing at his feet. Garrett opened his eyes without moving his head. The room was dark. The clock on the wall read 11:47. Coda was no longer on the rug. The dog was standing in the center of the living room facing the front door. Standing absolutely rigid, every line of his body straight and hard and as though he had been carved from stone. His head was slightly cocked. The fur along his spine from the base of his skull to the root of his tail was standing straight up, a ridge of bristling gray and white. Garrett did not move. He did not breathe. He watched his dog. And then he heard it. Not a bark, not a growl, something below both of those. A vibration. A deep rolling hum that came from the very bottom of Coda's chest, so low, it was almost below the range of human hearing. It was not a warning. It was a promise. It was the sound a predator makes when it has identified a threat and is calculating the precise moment to attack. Coda took one slow, deliberate step toward the front door, then another. And then Garrett heard what Coda had heard first, the soft, unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel, coming up his driveway, moving slowly, no headlights. No one came to the Hale Ranch at this hour. Not Earl Navarro, not the mail carrier, not anyone. Garrett swung his legs off the chair, his stocking feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He moved to the front window in a low crouch, keeping below the sill, old instincts taking over without conscious thought. Coda was instantly at his side, a silent shadow matching his movements. Garrett eased the edge of the window blind open with one finger, a fraction of an inch, enough to see. A vehicle was parked 30 yards from his front porch. It was a large black SUV, late model, perfectly clean. Its paint reflected the pale moonlight with a liquid sheen. It looked like it had been driven off a showroom floor 10 minutes ago. In the dusty, battered world of Otero County, where every vehicle wore a permanent coat of brown grime, it was as out of place as a submarine in a swimming pool. The headlights were off. The engine was off. Two doors opened and closed with quiet, solid, expensive-sounding thuds. Two figures emerged. They walked toward the house with confident, unhurried steps. They were not sneaking. They were not creeping. They walked the way men walk when they believe they have the authority to be wherever they are. Garrett moved to the front door. His blood was moving fast, but his hands were steady. Coda pressed against his left leg, the deep vibration of his growl still running through his body like a current. "Easy, boy," Garrett whispered. A sharp official knock. 3 precise blows on the wooden door, evenly spaced. Garrett flipped on the porch light. He took a slow breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door 6 inches, keeping his body and his foot behind it. His right hand gripped the edge of the door at shoulder height. His left hand rested on Coda's neck. Coda instantly filled the gap, pushing his head and shoulders into the 6-inch opening, his eyes locking onto the 2 men on the porch. His ears were forward, his lips were closed, but the growl had not stopped. It vibrated through Garrett's hand. 2 men, both in suits, dark, well-pressed, and completely inappropriate for a ranch in the New Mexico desert at midnight. Their shoes were polished, reflecting the yellow porch light, somehow untouched by the dust that covered everything else within 50 miles. The older man was in his 50s, neat gray hair trimmed close to his skull, a face that was almost pleasant, the kind of face that could smile at a funeral and not seem out of place. But his eyes were wrong. They were flat and empty, the color of wet slate, and they moved over Garrett with the quick professional assessment of a man who evaluated threats for a living. The younger one was in his early 30s, fit and lean with a sharp, impatient face and dark hair. He stood half a step behind the older man, slightly to the right, his weight on the balls of his feet. His eyes flicked from Garrett to Coda and back, And what Garrett saw in them was not fear, but annoyance. The look of a man who considers a dog an obstacle, not a danger. Mr. Garrett Hale. The older man spoke first. His voice was smooth and educated, with the flat, regionless accent of someone who had spent a career in government buildings. "Who is asking?" Garrett replied. His voice came out rough and low, still thick with the residue of sleep. "My name is Greer. This is my associate Collier. We are with the Bureau of Land Management." Garrett's blood ran cold, not because of the words, but because of the delivery. Too smooth, too practiced, too fast. The lie was prepackaged, rehearsed, and deployed with the ease of a man who had used it 100 times before. "Bureau of Land Management," Garrett said. His voice was flat as a plank. "It is almost midnight. We understand the hour is inconvenient, sir," the one called Greer continued. His smile was thin and polite and reached nowhere near his eyes. "We received an automated report of significant unauthorized excavation activity on this property. We are required by federal statute to inspect the site for environmental and treaty compliance. Standard procedure." The younger one, Collier, shifted his weight. His eyes went past Garrett, scanning the dark interior of the house, and then came back to the dog. "We need to see the excavation site, sir. If you would just step aside, we can complete our assessment and be on our way." Collier took half a step toward the door. It was the only step he got. Coda erupted. The deep subsonic growl that had been running through his chest like an underground river broke the surface. A sound tore from the dog's throat that was not a bark and not a snarl, but something older and more terrible than either. He bared his teeth, all of them. His lips peeled back from his gums to reveal white enamel and canine teeth that were designed by 10,000 years of selective breeding to do one thing very well. The muscles in his shoulders bunched and knotted. He lowered his head, his center of gravity dropping, his back legs coiling. Every line of his body communicated a single unmistakable message. "Come closer." Collier froze. His right hand twitched, moving instinctively toward the left side of his jacket before the older man, Greer, shot him a look that stopped the motion dead. Both men recognized the sound. Both had the training to know what it meant. That was not a warning. It was the last sound before violence. Garrett put his hand on Coda's neck. The dog's muscles were coiled, steel springs under the thick fur. "He is protective," Garrett said, stating what did not need to be stated. "We see that," Greer said. His polite mask was still in place, but something behind it had recalculated. He looked at Garrett with new attention, sizing him up. A tall man fit, standing with the natural balance and squared shoulders of someone with significant military training. And the dog. The dog was not a negotiable obstacle. Greer was a professional. He assessed probabilities. Forcing entry past an alert, aggressive German Shepherd and a combat veteran in a confined doorway was not a scenario with favorable odds. "This is private property," Garrett said. His voice had dropped to the register he had used in the field, quiet and cold, and absolutely without room for debate. "You have no warrant. The Bureau of Land Management does not make house calls at midnight. You need to leave now." Collier's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to argue, or worse. But Greer held up a hand, palm out, a gesture of surrender that was not surrender at all. "Very well, Mr. Hale. We do not want any trouble." He took a deliberate step backward, his polished shoes crunching on the porch boards, pulling Collier with him by sheer force of authority. "We will, however, have to file this as non-compliance. We will return at a more convenient time." "You do that," Garrett said. Greer gave a thin smile that made Garrett think of something cold-blooded and patient, something that could hold very still for a very long time. Then the older man turned, and the two of them walked back to the black SUV. They did not hurry. They got in. The doors closed with solid, expensive thuds. The engine started with a low, powerful hum, and the vehicle reversed, turned, and drove away down the gravel road, its red taillights growing smaller and dimmer until they vanished entirely into the dark. Garrett shut the front door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was very loud in the sudden quiet. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, his eyes closed, his body shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the massive chemical flood that follows a confrontation that could have gone very badly and did not. Coda whined. His entire body relaxed at once like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He nudged Garrett's hand, his tail giving a short, anxious wag. Garrett slid down the door and sat on the floor, his back against the wood. He wrapped his arms around his dog's neck and held him. "Good boy," he whispered. His voice was thick. "What a good boy, Coda. You held the line." They sat there in the dark for a long time. The next morning, Garrett drove to Tularosa. Coda sat in the passenger seat, bolt upright, scanning the road ahead, in the scrubland on both sides with the low, focused intensity of a sentry on watch. Garrett watched his rearview mirror the entire way. The road behind him was empty. No black SUV, no plume of dust. The emptiness itself felt like a threat. He parked in front of a small, immaculate bungalow on a quiet street shaded by old cottonwood trees. The yard was neat, planted with drought-resistant cacti and bright red geraniums that looked defiant against the brown landscape. This was the home of Marjorie Keene. Marjorie was in her late 70s, a widow. She had been the county's head librarian for 40 years before retiring, and she was a small, trim woman who moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime organizing the world into categories and was not about to stop now. Her eyes, bright blue and magnified to an almost startling size by thick reading glasses, missed nothing. She had known Garrett's family his entire life. His mother had been her neighbor. His wife, Sarah, had volunteered with her at the library reading to children on Saturday mornings. If there was a living, breathing historical archive of Otero County, it was Marjorie Keene. She opened the front door before he could knock. She was wiping her hands on a kitchen apron printed with small blue flowers. "Garrett Hale," she said, her voice warm but surprised. "And Coda. Well, this is a treat. Come in, come in." Coda knew this house. He nudged Marjorie's hand politely, his tail giving a low, friendly sweep, and went straight to the ceramic water bowl she kept for him in the kitchen. He had been coming here since he was a rescue. Marjorie kept biscuits in a tin on the counter. "Morning, Marjorie," Garrett said. He tried to force a casualness into his voice that felt brittle and fake, like paint over rust. "Hope I am not disturbing you." "Nonsense, I was making tea. You look like you could use some. You look like you have not slept in a week." "Sit down." "Sit." Her living room was the opposite of his ranch house. It was small and cozy, every wall lined with bookshelves overflowing with volumes, stacked two deep, neat piles of magazines on side tables, and the warm, comforting smell of lemon furniture oil and brewing Earl Grey tea. Garrett sat in a floral armchair that seemed designed for someone half his size. Marjorie returned with two steaming mugs and settled into her own chair across from him. Now she said, her magnified blue eyes fixing on him with the expression of a woman who had been sorting fact from fiction for 4 decades. "What brings you all the way into town, Garrett? And do not tell me it is for my baking. I have not seen you since the county fair." Garrett wrapped his large hands around the warm mug. He had rehearsed this in the truck. He needed to be general, indirect, feel out what she knew without revealing what he had found. "It is a strange question, Marjorie. I was clearing some land on the north pasture, near the old mound, found some debris, government junk, old metal with a name stenciled on it. Looked like it had been buried a long time. I was curious, does the name Project Stillwater mean anything to you?" The change in Marjorie Keene was immediate. It was as though someone had flipped a switch behind her eyes. The warmth did not disappear exactly, but it was joined by something else. Something sharp and cautious and very, very old. Her teacup stopped halfway to her lips. "Garrett," she said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. "That is a name I have not heard spoken aloud in more than 50 years. Where exactly did you see it?" "Just on a piece of rusted metal," Garrett said. He knew he was lying badly. Looked like an old barrel lid. "Why? Was it something important?" Marjorie set her cup down on the saucer. The small ceramic clink was very loud in the quiet room. She stared past him, past the bookshelves, at something that existed only in memory. Important, she said, as though tasting the word. No, important is not the right word. It was a shadow. Everyone in the basin knew the base was busy in those years, of course. This was the 1960s, the middle of the Cold War. They were testing everything imaginable out at White Sands. Holloman was running operations around the clock. But Project Stillwater, she paused. That was the one nobody talked about. She leaned forward, her voice dropped further, almost to a whisper. There were rumors, Garrett, things the newspapers would not print. People talked quietly in kitchens and at church, but never in public. A tremor in the summer of '68, shaking in the ground that was not an earthquake. Everyone felt it. The dishes rattled in the cupboards. But it was not on any seismograph that the university in Las Cruces could find. Then ambulances. Military ambulances seen going onto the base late at night. Going in, not coming out. Strange lights on the ridge, sounds from underground. She took a breath, and then just as suddenly as it all started, it stopped. Complete silence. They shut it all down, classified it, buried it, like it never happened, and people stopped talking about it because in those days when the military told you something did not happen, you accepted that it did not happen and you went about your business. Then Marjorie said the thing that changed everything. But you must know your father worked on it, Garrett. His head snapped up. A rush of blood flooded his ears so suddenly that the room seemed to tilt. What? I knew he worked at Holloman. I never knew the project name. He never talked about it. Marjorie's expression softened instantly, filling with a deep old sadness that transformed her entire face. Oh, Garrett, I am sorry. I assumed you knew. Your father, Douglas. He was not just on their project. He was their safety engineer. The man responsible for making sure the whole thing did not kill anyone. Safety engineer. The words from the ledger surfaced in his mind like bodies rising from deep water. DH. Recommending immediate halt. DH temporarily relieved. I remember him. Marjorie continued softly. He used to come into the library to read geology journals. He always seemed to be carrying something heavy, not in his hands, behind his eyes. She paused. I saw him in town right before they shut everything down. He looked haunted, Garrett. Thin as a rail. He told me he was worried about the structural integrity. Those were his exact words. Structural integrity. I did not know what he meant at the time. She took a sip of her tea and Garrett saw that her hand was trembling slightly. And then after it all stopped, he died. Right after the project was officially terminated. A heart attack, Garrett said automatically. The words came out flat, mechanical. They were the words he had heard his entire life, the official explanation, the story that explained the absence at the center of his childhood. Marjorie met his gaze. Her eyes behind those thick magnifying lenses were clear and unwavering, and full of something that Garrett realized with a sickening lurch was not sympathy. It was suspicion. Old, quiet, carefully maintained suspicion that she had carried alone for more than 50 years. He was 45 years old, Garrett, and he had just passed his annual physical. The base physician said he had the heart of an ox. Those were the words used, the heart of an ox. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the air between them. Some of us, the older families, we always found that suspicious. A man that careful, that meticulous, a man who was trying to sound an alarm, dying that suddenly, that conveniently, right after his project was erased. She shook her head slowly. It just felt tidy, too tidy. Garrett felt the blood leave his face. The vague childhood tragedy of his father's death, a sad but random act of biology, curdled in his gut and hardened into something cold and deliberate. Not a heart attack, not stress, not bad luck. They killed him. Marjorie saw the change on his face. She saw the grief harden into something darker, something with edges, and she leaned forward and placed her small, frail hand on his forearm. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Garrett, listen to me. You asked, and I told you because you are Douglas's son, and you have a right to know what the people in this county have whispered for 60 years. But now you must hear what I am about to say. That was a long time ago. The men who did those things, the kind of men who do those things, they do not just disappear. They do not retire. They get older. They get more powerful. They get more connected. And the organizations they serve get better at what they do. You are stirring up ghosts, Garrett. Powerful ghosts. Let them sleep. You have to let the past stay buried." Garrett could not speak. His throat was thick. He stood up the chair, scraping loudly on the wooden floor. Coda was at his side, instantly pressing against his leg, his body tense, reading the sudden shift in his owner's chemistry. "Thank you for the tea, Marjorie." His voice was barely a whisper. As he reached the front door, Marjorie added her voice lighter, trying to crack the tension that had filled her small living room like smoke. "You are as stubborn as your father was, you know that. Just like my nephew Nolan Keene. He is an investigative reporter up in Albuquerque, always digging up things that are better left buried. Runs in the family, I suppose." Garrett nodded. He did not really hear the name. Not yet. He stepped out into the bright, hard sunlight, Coda at his heel. He got into his truck, his mind reeling. Safety engineer, suspicious death, silenced. He started the engine. His hands were shaking again. He pulled away from the curb. His eyes went to the rear view mirror, out of habit, checking for traffic before merging onto the empty street. He froze. One block behind him, parked in the deep shade of a cottonwood tree on the opposite side of the street, sat a black SUV. Clean, late model, perfectly out of place. The sun glinted off its windshield, and behind the tinted glass, Garrett could not see faces. But he did not need to. They had not just come to his house in the middle of the night. They had not been guessing. They had followed him. They were watching him right now, and they had seen him walk into Marjorie Keene's house. They had seen who he was talking to. They knew he was asking questions, and now they knew who had answered them. Garrett looked from the SUV in his mirror to Marjorie's small, vulnerable bungalow with its bright red geraniums and its cottonwood shade. A sick, cold weight settled in his stomach. Marjorie's warning echoed in his head. Let the past stay buried. He gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles went white. He looked at the SUV one more time. And a cold, familiar fire, the kind he had not felt since the mountains, since the caves, since the war, began to burn in his chest. It was not panic. It was not grief. It was the quiet, focused rage of a soldier who has been given a target. It was too late. The past was wide awake, and it was looking right at him. The drive back to the ranch took 15 minutes. Garrett drove under the speed limit, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The black SUV was gone. It had pulled away from the cottonwood shade and vanished. But the cold sweat on his neck was real, and the knowledge that they had watched him talk to Marjorie was the most real thing of all. When they reached the ranch, Garrett locked the heavy cattle gate at the entrance to his property, threading the chain through the bars and snapping the padlock shut. It was a gate he had not bothered to close in years. A length of rusted chain and a padlock that a bolt cutter could defeat in 3 seconds. But it was something. It was the act of a man drawing a line. Inside the house, he pulled every window blind closed. He stood in the dim silence of his own kitchen. He was a target. His home was no longer a sanctuary. He needed to hear the tapes. He remembered his father's old workshop, the small lean-to shed it attached to the west side of the barn. It had not been entered in decades, not since Douglas Hale died. Garrett's mother had kept the door shut, as though closing it could preserve something of her husband, and after she passed, Garrett had simply never found a reason to go in. He left Coda guarding the back door and crossed the yard. The workshop door groaned on its hinges, releasing a breath of air that smelled of dust and dried machine oil, and something faintly sweet that might have been old solder flux. The interior was small and crowded. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding glass jars of sorted screws and bolts coils of copper wire, a soldering iron with a blackened tip, old vacuum tubes in their original boxes. The tools of a man who understood machines the way a surgeon understands anatomy. In the back corner, under a stiff canvas drop cloth, Garrett found what he was looking for. A reel-to-reel tape player. An Akai. Heavy and beautiful with brushed aluminum panels and analog VU meters, and the solid, overbuilt feel of Japanese engineering from the 1960s. It was his father's most prized possession. Garrett knew this not from memory because he had no memories of his father, but because his mother had told him. Your father loved that machine. He would sit in his workshop after dinner and play music on it. Jazz, mostly. Sometimes he would just record himself talking or working through problems out loud. He said the machine helped him think. Garrett carried the heavy player back to the kitchen and set it on the table. He retrieved the gray ammunition box from the cedar chest in his bedroom closet, the chest that had been Sarah's, the chest that still smelled faintly of her perfume and of cedar wood. His hands trembled as he opened the first tape canister and removed the reel. The plastic was yellowed and brittle, and the magnetic tape itself was a thin brown ribbon that looked fragile enough to snap if he breathed on it too hard. He threaded the tape through the machine's guides with exaggerated care, following the path marked by small embossed arrows on the deck plate. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He flipped the power switch. The machine hummed. A small amber light glowed warmly on the front panel. The reels began to turn slowly, at first the tape moving from left to right with a soft whisper. Then came the hiss, the low electric hiss of old magnetic particles passing over a playback. Head, the sound of recorded silence, the sound of a moment in time that had been frozen in iron oxide for 60 years and was now at last being allowed to speak. A faint click on the tape, the sound of a microphone being switched on. And then a voice. Test. Test. October 3rd, 1968. This is Douglas Hale. This is a private recording. Garrett stopped breathing. His hand gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. It was a voice he had never heard. He had no childhood memories of this voice telling him a bedtime story, calling him in for dinner, singing off key in the shower. There were no home movies, no answering machine messages, no recordings of any kind. His father had died before the age of consumer video cameras, and his mother had not owned a tape recorder. For 54 years, Douglas Hale had existed in Garrett's life only as photographs and absence, a face in a picture frame, a name on a headstone, and now the space was filling. The voice was calm and measured with the careful cadence of an engineer accustomed to documenting observations. But underneath the professional control, Garrett could hear something else. A tightness, a strain in the vocal cords that spoke of a man who was working very hard to keep his composure. Coda, sensing the tremor that ran through Garrett's body, got up from the back door and came to his side. He pushed his cold nose into Garrett's rigid hand. Garrett looked down at the tree and his eyes were wet. "It is okay, boy," Garrett whispered. His voice cracked on the second word. "It is my father." The voice on the tape continued, and the kitchen filled with the words of a dead man. This is a private log supplemental to the official project record. I am storing these observations at my residence off-site in case the official documentation is altered or removed. I have reason to believe this has already occurred. A pause on the tape, the sound of a man taking a nervous sip from a cup, the small, intimate click of ceramic against a table. Project Stillwater is not what was described to the Congressional Oversight Committee. The project was presented as a deep geological survey program, a study of subsurface fault structures in the Tularosa Basin. This is false. Project Stillwater is a weapons development program. Its objective is the creation and controlled deployment of subsurface seismic events. In plain language, it is a device designed to generate earthquakes. Targeted low-yield earthquakes directed at specific coordinates. The theoretical application is the destabilization of enemy infrastructure military installations and population centers from a continent away without any visible act of war. Garrett sank deeper into his chair. A seismic weapon, built in the desert of New Mexico in the shadow of white sands during the most paranoid years of the Cold War. A weapon designed to shake the earth beneath your enemy's feet and make it look like an act of God. The tests conducted in July of this year, designated Test 4 Alpha and Test 4 Bravo, were not the controlled successes reported to Washington. They were a catastrophe. We generated a seismic event that exceeded all projected parameters by a factor of 3. The energy pulse did not follow the predicted vector. It propagated laterally through a deep fault structure that our geological surveys had failed to identify a fault that connects to the primary aquifer system beneath the Tularosa Basin. The Otero Aquifer, the main water table for this entire region. Garrett's mind flashed to the Geiger counter sitting by the kitchen sink, its needle twitching, its soft, patient ticking. The sensors we placed in the aquifer monitoring wells are showing elevated readings. The contamination is not catastrophic. It is not an acute radiation event, but it is persistent. Low-level radionuclide contamination, strontium-90. The isotope is in the water table. It is migrating, and it is not going away. Douglas Hale's voice changed. The engineering calm cracked, and what came through was raw and human and afraid. I reported my findings to the project director and to the oversight team from the Atomic Energy Commission. I showed them the data, the sensor readings, the migration models. I recommended an immediate permanent shutdown of all testing and a full environmental remediation of the aquifer. I recommended public disclosure. A pause. A long one. The tape hissed. They told me to recalibrate the sensors. They said my readings were anomalous. They said I was fatigued and that my judgment was impaired by stress. They did not dispute the data. They classified the data. They classified the contamination itself. They sealed the sublevels, trapping the physical evidence underground, and they are calling the project a failure due to unforeseen geological instability. That is the official story. It is a lie. The project did not fail because of bad geology. The project succeeded in exactly what it was designed to do. It shook the earth, and it broke something that cannot be fixed. And they know it, and they are burying it. Garrett sat motionless. The amber light of the tape player glowed in the dim kitchen. His father's voice filled the room, and it was no longer the voice of an engineer. It was the voice of a father, speaking to a son he feared he might never see grow up. They relieved me of duty yesterday. Officially, I have been placed on medical leave for psychological evaluation. The project physician, a man I have never seen before, signed the order. They have assigned personnel to monitor my residence. I have seen a vehicle parked on the ridge road above the ranch on 3 consecutive nights. They are watching me. They are afraid of what I know and what I might say. They are bringing in a containment team from Washington, not to contain the radiation, to contain me. The voice cracked again. A sound that might have been a breath, or might have been a thief compressed and strangled. I think they are going to silence me. If something happens to me, if it is sudden, if the doctors say it was natural, it was not. It was them. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it was quieter, softer, stripped of everything professional and careful. It was just a man alone in a workshop talking to a machine because there was no one left he could trust. I love you, Garrett. Be good for your mother. I am sorry I cannot be there. I tried to do the right thing. I want you to know that. Whatever they say about me, whatever story they tell, I tried. A click. The tape ran out. The reels spun in empty silence, the tail end of the tape flapping softly against the hub. Garrett Hale sat in his kitchen, and the world was very still. He was not aware of time passing. He was aware only of the voice. His father's voice, speaking to him across 60 years, across death, across silence. I think they are going to silence me. Marjorie Keene's voice in her living room with her trembling teacup. Too tidy. The black SUV on his driveway. Greer's flat, empty eyes. Collier's impatient twitch toward his jacket. It was not a heart attack. It was not stress. It was an execution, carried out by professionals, documented as natural causes and buried beneath 60 years of classified paperwork. They had murdered his father for trying to protect the water that people drank. And they had gotten away with it completely. The sadness and confusion that had lived inside Garrett since childhood, the vague, nameless ache of growing up without a father, a feeling he had never been able to articulate because he had never understood its true source, vanished. It was burned away in a single instant, consumed by a fire that was clean and cold and absolutely without mercy. Rage. The black total rage that he had known in the mountains. The rage that had kept him alive when men around him were dying. The rage that had made him effective and lethal, and had then in the years after eaten him alive from the inside. The rage he had spent a decade trying to bury because it terrified him more than the enemy ever had. It came back now, all of it, at once. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. A roaring filled his ears. His hands resting flat on the kitchen table, clenched into fists so tight that his fingernails bit into his palms and drew small crescents of blood. He could feel his pulse in his temples, a hard, rapid hammering that shook his skull. He wanted to destroy something. He wanted to put his fist through the kitchen wall. He looked at the tape player, the machine that had delivered this poison, and he had a sudden, violent urge to sweep it from the table and smash it on the floor and stomp on it until there was nothing left but broken metal and shredded tape. He stood up from his chair. His body was trembling with the force of what was inside him. He took a step toward the machine. His hand rose. A sharp, hard pressure slammed into his right elbow. He barely felt it. He was in the red, lost in the blinding white noise of his own fury, and the physical world had become distant and irrelevant. He shook his arm. The pressure came back harder, a cold, wet force driving into his tensed forearm with the full weight of a large animal behind it, and cutting through the roar in his ears, thin but insistent as a blade of sound. A high-pitched, desperate whine. Garrett stopped. He looked down. Coda was standing beside him, pushing his muzzle against Garrett's forearm with everything he had. Not gently, not tentatively, with force, with urgency. The dog's entire body was rigid, his back legs braced against the kitchen floor, his shoulder muscles bunched, driving his nose into Garrett's arm, as though trying to physically push him back from an invisible edge. And he was looking up at Garrett with an expression that was not fear and not confusion, but something that Garrett, even in his state, recognized as a command. The dog's eyes were locked onto his, unblinking, burning with a fierce, desperate intelligence. "Are you here? Come back to me." Right now, the rage fractured. A crack appeared, and through the crack, the kitchen was visible. The table, the tape player, the light, the date. Garrett looked at his hand. It was raised above the machine, clenched into a fist so tight that his fingers had gone numb, and the tendons in his wrist stood out like cables. He stared at it as though it belonged to someone else. He uncurled his fingers, one by one. They were stiff and reluctant, and his palm was marked with 4 red crescents where his nails had broken the skin. He let out a breath, a huge, shuddering exhalation that emptied his lungs completely and left him hollow. The roar subsided. The kitchen came back into focus in all its ordinary dusty detail. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the Geiger counter, the smell of old coffee and dog fur. "Okay," he whispered. The word was a surrender. His legs gave out. He sank to the kitchen floor and sat on the cold linoleum with his knees drawn up and his head in his hands. The rage was gone. It left behind a cold, hollow space, an emptiness that felt like the inside of the bunker. Coda was on him instantly. The dog pressed his entire body against Garrett's side, pushing his head under Garrett's arm, wedging himself into the space between Garrett and the cabinet, as though trying to fill the emptiness with his own warmth. He whined softly, a continuous low sound, and he licked the tears that were running down Garrett's face. Garrett wrapped both arms around the dog's neck. He buried his face in the warm fur and held on the way a man in deep water holds a piece of wreckage with the grip of someone who knows that letting go means drowning. He knew Garrett whispered into Coda's fur. His voice was thick and broken. He knew they were coming for him, and he was all alone. He had nobody. Coda licked his face again, a slow, deliberate stroke, a gesture so simple and so ancient that it predated language, predated civilization, predated everything except the bond between a man and the animal that had chosen him. Not anymore, Garrett said. The rage passed as it always did, leaving clarity in its wake, the way a wildfire leaves bare, clean ground. Garrett sat on his kitchen floor and felt the cold, hard focus settle into his bones. He was a soldier and his position was compromised. He was an isolated target holding the objective, and the enemy had superior numbers, superior resources, and complete knowledge of his location. He needed an ally. Marjorie's words came back to him, a fragment he had barely registered at the time. My nephew, Nolan Keene, investigative reporter, Albuquerque, always digging up things that are better left buried. He stood. His movements were precise and economical. He went to the phone. He called Marjorie. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. Marjorie, it is Garrett. I am sorry to call so late. I need your nephew's number. It is about my father. It is about Project Stillwater. A silence on the line that lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Marjorie's voice, every trace of sleep burned away. I was afraid of this. I will text it to you. Be careful, Garrett. Please, please be careful. A minute later, his phone chimed with a number. He dialed. The phone rang twice. A voice answered, young and sharp, and carrying the particular blend of skepticism and caffeine that Garrett associated with people who worked in newsrooms. Nolan Keene, saw him. Mr. Keene, my name is Garrett Hale. Your Aunt Marjorie gave me your number. Yeah, Mr. Hale, she called in. Nolan cut in his voice fast and clipped a city voice. She said you were asking about something called Project Stillwater. Look, my aunt is a wonderful woman, and I love her, but she collects local folklore the way other people collect stamps. I am a journalist, sir. I deal in facts, not ghost stories. With all due respect, I am not sure what you think I can do for you. Garrett felt a flash of the old rage. He shut it down, breathed, counted to 3. I do not have time for your skepticism, Mr. Keene. I am not calling about folklore. I am calling about proof. I have his voice. A beat of silence. His voice. Whose voice? Garrett set the phone down on the kitchen table next to the Akai. He pressed the play button. The reels turned. The hiss filled the kitchen. And then Douglas Hale's voice came through the speaker and traveled down the phone line to an apartment in Albuquerque. I think they are going to silence me. If something happens to me, if it is sudden, it was not natural. It was them. Garrett stopped the tape. He picked up the phone. The silence on the other end was total. Mr. Hale. Nolan's voice had changed completely. The skepticism, the professional detachment, the slightly condescending tone, all of it was gone, replaced by something cold and stunned and absolutely serious. Where are you? No. Do not tell me on the phone. I am leaving Albuquerque right now. It is a 3-hour drive. Do not talk to anyone else. Do not go anywhere. Lock your doors. I will be there by 2 in the morning. Garrett hung up. He looked at Coda. The dog was watching him from the doorway, his tail still. From outside, a scraping sound on the porch. Coda let out a single low woof, and his hackles rose. 2 miles away on a high, dark ridge overlooking the Hale Ranch, Harlan Greer lowered a pair of thermal imaging binoculars from his eyes. The green and white world of heat signatures showed him Garrett's shape moving from window to center of the house. He is active, Greer said. His voice was a flat whisper in the dark. He is on the phone. He is panicking, Vance Collier said from beside him. His voice was tight with impatience. He was rubbing his arm where Coda's growl had vibrated through the door earlier that night. Let me go down there. Let me take it. You want to go against that dog when the owner is awake and alert, Greer said. It was not a question. No, we observe. We are authorized for surveillance and recovery, not forced entry. Not yet. We wait. The situation changed at 1:40 in the morning. A new pair of headlights appeared on the county road moving fast. Not a black SUV, a dusty compact sedan. Greer watched through his binoculars as the car pulled up to the ranch gate. As a figure got out, unlocked the gate with a key Garrett must have left, drove through, and parked next to the ranch truck. He watched the front door of the house open, the rectangle of warm light spilling onto the porch, and the new figure step inside. Collier, Greer said. His voice was dangerously quiet. Run the plate. 3 minutes later, Collier had an answer. The vehicle was registered to Nolan Keene. Address in Albuquerque. Occupation listed on the registration as journalist. Employer listed as the Albuquerque Journal. Greer was silent for a long time. He lowered the binoculars and stared at the distant house with his naked eyes. And for the first time, his flat professional composure showed a crack. Not anger, something colder. The expression of a man watching a containable situation become uncontainable. He has involved the press, Greer said. The asset is compromised. He picked up a satellite phone. The number he dialed routed through 4 relays before it reached a desk in a building with no sign on the door. The situation at Site B has escalated. The subject has obtained materials from the vault and has made contact with a member of the press. He is likely planning to leak. I am requesting authorization for immediate sanitation. He listened. His face did not change. He ended the call. What is the play? Collier asked. There was a new tension in his voice, eager and predatory. Simple, Greer said. You retrieve the assets. I create a diversion. Greer moved first. He descended the ridge in the dark, circling wide around the ranch to approach the barn from the blind side. He carried a small incendiary device, military grade, the size of a pack of cigarettes, with a 15-minute chemical delay fuse. He placed it deep inside the pile of dry hay stacked against the barn's interior wall. 15 minutes, enough time for him to return to his overwatch position on the ridge. Enough time for the device to produce a fire that would look to any investigator like an electrical fault in old wiring. He was back on the ridge in 12 minutes. He settled behind his rifle scope and waited. Inside the ranch house, Nolan Keene sat at the kitchen table, examining the evidence with latex-gloved hands. He was young, maybe late 20s, with messy dark hair and glasses, and the nervous, caffeinated energy of a man who lived on deadlines. He looked more like a graduate student than a serious journalist, but his eyes behind the glasses were sharp and quick, and they moved over the ledger and the tapes with the controlled hunger of a man who had spent years chasing stories half this size. Coda had sniffed him thoroughly when he arrived, and after a moment of consideration, had given a tentative low wag of his tail. Nolan, to his credit, had waited respectfully for the dog's verdict before stepping inside. Garrett, this is... Nolan's voice was barely a whisper. He looked up from the ledger. This is not a local story. This is not a state story. This is 60 years of a federal cover-up, a murdered whistleblower, radioactive contamination of a public water supply, illegal weapons testing, classification fraud. Coda, who had been lying under the table, lifted his head. His ears rotated toward the back of the house. His nostrils flared. Then he was on his feet, his body rigid, a low growl building in his chest. Garrett was up in the same instant. He did not ask Coda what was wrong. He had learned years ago that the dog always knew first. Then they both smelled it. Sharp, chemical, acrid, the unmistakable smell of smoke. Garrett ran to the living room window and pulled the blind aside. The night was glowing. Flickering violent orange light was climbing the side of his barn. The dry hay inside had caught, and the flames were already licking the roof line, sending a column of black smoke into the starless sky. My barn, it is on fire. Every instinct screamed at him. Save the ranch. Save the feed. It is your livelihood. He grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher from the wall bracket. Stay here, Nolan. Lock the door behind me. He sprinted across the yard toward the inferno, the extinguisher bouncing against his leg. The heat hit him at 30 yards, a wall of baking air that dried the sweat on his face instantly. The fire was already too big for a hand extinguisher, but his body was moving on autopilot. He did not see the shadow detach itself from the darkness at the back of the house. The moment Garrett was 50 yards from the house, committed to the fire, Collier kicked in the back door. The old wood splintered and the lock burst inward with a sound like a gunshot. Nolan screamed, scrambling back from the table, knocking his chair over. Collier was through the door in 2 strides, his face covered by a black balaclava, his voice a snarl. Where are the tapes? Give me the box, now! He grabbed Nolan by the front of his shirt, lifting the smaller man off his feet. Nolan's glasses flew off his face and clattered on the floor. But Collier had forgotten about the dog. Coda had been in the living room when the back door exploded inward. For the span of 1 heartbeat, he assessed. The man in the kitchen, the threat to the house, the person inside who was not his owner, but who was under his owner's protection. The smell of the intruder, a smell he knew, the same man from 2 nights ago on the porch, the man whose jacket had twitched toward a weapon. 1 heartbeat. Then Coda launched himself across the kitchen. No bark, no warning growl. In protection mode, Coda did not waste breath on sounds. He drove off the linoleum with a force that left claw marks in the floor and hit Collier square in the chest. The impact knocked the bigger man off his feet. Collier went backward over the fallen chair, his grip on Nolan breaking, and he hit the floor hard. Before he could get his hands up, Coda was on him. The dog's jaws clamped onto Collier's left forearm with a force that drove through the fabric of his jacket and into the muscle underneath. The sound was wet and terrible. Collier screamed, a high, raw animal sound. He was a trained operative, but he was in a fight that no amount of tactical training prepares a man for. A fight with a large, powerful, enraged animal that has no concept of negotiation or rules of engagement. Coda bit and held and shook his neck, muscles bunching his body low, dragging the screaming man across the kitchen floor. Outside, Garrett heard it. The scream came first muffled by the walls, but sharp enough to cut through the roar of the burning barn. Then beneath the scream, the sound of Coda fighting. Not barking, fighting. The deep, sustained guttural snarl of a dog that has committed completely. A diversion. It was a diversion. He dropped the useless fire extinguisher and ran. He crossed the 50 yards back to the house in seconds, the orange light of the burning barn throwing his shadow long and black ahead of him. He burst through the shattered back door frame. The kitchen was chaos. The table was shoved sideways. The chair was broken. Nolan was on the floor against the far wall, his face white, his mouth open. Collier was on his back, thrashing, trying to reach the pistol holstered under his left arm, but he could not reach across his own body because Coda was attached to his left arm and would not let go. The dog was snarling continuously, his eyes half closed, his front paws braced on Collier's chest. Garrett did not hesitate. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and drove his shoulder into Collier's rib cage. Collier's head slammed into the base of the kitchen cabinets. Garrett's hand found the man's right wrist and pinned it to the floor and delivered a short, precise strike to the soft tissue of Collier's throat. Not hard enough to kill, hard enough to end the fight. From outside, the sharp crack of a high-velocity rifle shot split the night. It was not aimed at Garrett. The shot hit the 50-gallon steel drum of diesel fuel that stood beside the barn. The drum detonated. A massive concussive hump of expanding vapor and igniting fuel followed by a blinding white flash. The shockwave hit the house, rattling the windows, cracking the kitchen glass, shaking dust from the ceiling. The heat came through the broken window like a fist, a wall of blistering oxygen eating heat, and with it came the smell, diesel, burning metal, superheated air. Garrett froze. He was not in his kitchen. He was in Shahi Kot, March 2002. The vehicle in front of him had just disappeared. The air was fire. He was deaf. He was blind. He was 28 years old and he was going to die. His body locked, every muscle, every joint. His hands went rigid and useless. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing the kitchen. 1 second, 1.5 seconds. It was enough. Greer came through the back door, fast and efficient. He grabbed Collier by the tactical vest and hauled the bleeding man to his feet with a strength that seemed impossible for his age. He dragged Collier toward the door, tearing his arm free from Coda's jaws with a violent twist. Garrett blinked. The kitchen materialized. He saw Greer's back disappearing through the doorframe. He saw Collier's boots dragging on the floor, leaving smears of blood. "No!" Garrett roared. He scrambled up, lunging for the door. He got to the porch just in time to see Greer shove Collier into the back of the black SUV. The engine was already running. The vehicle fishtailed in the gravel and accelerated down the driveway. The red taillights shrank and vanished. Garrett stood on the porch, his chest heaving, staring at nothing. Behind him, the barn was a pillar of fire. In front of him, the darkness had swallowed his enemies. Coda was beside him, barking furiously into the empty night, his muzzle dark and wet. 1.5 seconds. He had frozen for 1.5 seconds, and it had been enough for them to escape. His own damaged brain had handed them a window, and they had driven through it. He looked down at the porch. In the flickering orange light of the burning barn, something glinted on the kitchen floor just inside the broken door. He stepped back inside, knelt. In a small, dark pool of Collier's blood lay a brown leather wallet, torn from the man's pocket during the struggle with Coda. Garrett picked it up. His hands were steady now. He opened the wallet, a Virginia driver's license, Vance Collier, and behind the license a laminated white card with a magnetic strip and a photograph. Cerberus Ridge Logistics, Defense Logistics Contractor. The ghost finally had a name. For the next hour, the kitchen became a frantic operations center. The barn was beyond saving. Coda sat at the broken back door, an immovable guardian growling at every gust of wind. Garrett and Nolan worked with desperate speed. Garrett opened the fragile ledger and laid it on the flatbed scanner, page by page. Nolan uploaded each scanned image to the newspaper's encrypted server. When the ledger was done, Garrett scanned Collier's driver's license and the Cerberus Ridge access card. Then the tapes. They could not be scanned. Nolan placed his phone next to the Akai speaker with a professional audio recording application open. Garrett pressed play. Douglas Hale's voice filled the kitchen one more time, and this time it was being captured, digitally uploaded to a server in Albuquerque that Cerberus Ridge could not reach. When the last tape was recorded, Nolan sat back. It is done. The data is safe. They can burn this house to the ground, and the evidence is still out there. Garrett shook his head. They will say the digital copies are fabricated. A grieving, unstable son with PTSD, a sensationalist reporter. The originals are what matter. The mold on the paper, the magnetic signature on the tapes, the blood on the wallet, and the DNA it carries. Physical evidence. He knew what he had to do. He found a heavy military surplus ammunition can in the workshop steel with a thick rubber gasket in the lid, designed to be waterproof and airtight. He placed the ledger inside, the 3 reels of tape, and the wallet of Vance Collier. He closed the lid. The latch snapped shut with a sound of finality. He took the can and a short entrenching tool and walked out into the smoky yard. Coda came with him, moving like a wolf, silent, fanning out ahead, head high, scanning the darkness. They crossed the yard and reached the north pasture, the bulldozer, the buried hatch. Garrett did not open the bunker. His father had been buried in secrets in that hole. Garrett would bury the truth beside it. He dropped into the pit he had dug days earlier and began to excavate a new cavity, not downward but sideways. burrowing horizontally into the hard-packed earth beneath the steel frame of the hatch itself. He dug until his arm was buried to the shoulder, deep, hidden, invisible to anyone standing above. He shoved the ammunition can into the cavity. He packed the earth back with his fists, pounding it flat until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. He climbed out. He started the bulldozer, drove it forward, and parked it with his heavy blade directly over the spot 10 tons of steel covering his secret. He climbed down. Coda was waiting at the base of the machine, looking up his tail, giving one slow wag. "It is safe, boy," Garrett whispered. "It is safe now." The morning after the fire, Garrett logged into his bank account. The screen displayed a single line of text in red. "Account frozen, pending federal review." They had not gotten the originals, so they had frozen his life instead. His phone rang. Unknown number. He put it on speaker. Coda growled. Harlan Greer's voice filled the kitchen, calm and smooth and absolutely without warmth. "Hale, I am glad to see you are still with us. It appears you had an eventful evening. Terrible thing, that barn fire. You really should be more careful with flammable materials." Then a different sound came through the speaker. Muffled, a woman's voice, sharp and protesting. "Let me go. Get your hands off me." Garrett's blood turned to ice. "Marjorie! She is quite spirited for her age," Greer said. His voice dropped. "But fragile. The drill is simple. The originals. All of them. The tapes, the ledger, and my associate's property. You bring them to us. We return the woman. Diablo Canyon. Before noon. Come alone. If we see your reporter, if we hear a siren, she will not see the afternoon." The line went dead. Garrett stood at the kitchen table, the phone silent in his hand. Nolan was staring at him, ashen. Coda was pressed against Garrett's leg, the growl vibrating. Garrett picked up the second ammunition can from the workshop, the empty one, and began filling it with rusted tools, a short length of chain, and 2 blank tape reels from his father's desk. He built the decoy with the careful, methodical focus of a man assembling a weapon. He carried it to his truck. He opened the driver's door and sat behind the wheel. He placed his hands on the steering wheel. They were shaking, not the fine tremor of adrenaline, not the controlled vibration of anger. These were the deep, uncontrollable shakes of a man confronting the one enemy he could not outrun or outfight: himself, his own broken mind. He had frozen for 1.5 seconds the night before, and in that window, everything had fallen apart. Now he was driving into a canyon to face armed professionals with a hostage's life depending on his ability to not freeze again. And he did not know if he could do it. He dropped his forehead to the steering wheel. The vinyl was cold against his skin. He closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, fire. The vehicle. The mountain. The sound of men dying. And closer, the diesel drum exploding. The heat. The paralysis. He was going to fail. He was going to get Marjorie killed. A pressure against his right hand. Steady. Warm. Familiar as his own heartbeat. He opened his eyes and looked down. Coda had come from the house. The truck door was still open, and the dog had placed his front paws on the running board and stretched up, laying his heavy head across Garrett's lap, not on his knee, on his hands, directly on top of the hands that were shaking. The weight of the dog's head was maybe 10 pounds. It was warm. It was alive. It breathed slowly and evenly, the rib cage expanding and contracting in a rhythm as steady and ancient as the tide. And above that warm, breathing weight, 2 eyes looked up at Garrett with an expression that contained no doubt. No fear, no hesitation, no memory of failure or expectation of disaster, just trust. Complete, absolute. The kind of trust that does not calculate odds or weigh evidence or prepare for disappointment. The kind of trust that simply exists as fundamental and unarguable as gravity. You are here. I am here. We do this. Garrett breathed. He matched the dog's rhythm. In through the nose, 3 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The shaking in his hands diminished. Slowly, the way rain eases not all at once, but in stages, the drops getting smaller and further apart until you realize it has stopped. Good boy, Garrett said. His voice was thick and rough. He looked up. Nolan was standing by the truck, his face tight with fear. I am coming with you, Nolan said. No. Garrett got out of the truck. His voice was clear now. I need you to be a reporter, Nolan, not a soldier. He pointed to the high rocky ridge east of Diablo Canyon. You take my binoculars and your camera. You get up on that ridge 30 minutes before I drive in. You find a position with full line of sight to the canyon floor, and you do not move. You film everything. From the moment I enter that canyon, you record every second. What if they hurt you? Nolan asked. Then you make them famous, Garrett said. Now go. Take my phone. Call the state police, Captain Ian Chambers. Tell him the location. Tell him it is a kidnapping in progress by rogue defense contractors. Tell him a veteran is under fire. Use those words, and tell him to wait for your signal. If they move too early, Marjorie is dead. Nolan took the phone. He grabbed his camera bag and began climbing the ridge trail at close to a run. Garrett turned back to the truck. He looked at Coda. All right, boy. This is it. Load up. He opened the rear door of the extended cab. Before leaving the ranch, he had cranked the rear window of the cab down halfway, creating a gap wide enough for a large dog to fit through. It was a detail he had thought of while building the decoy, a quiet tactical decision made by the part of his brain that still thought like a ranger. He pointed to the dark footwell behind the passenger seat. In the hole. No sound, no movement, until you hear me whistle. Coda jumped up into the truck, crawled into the small dark space, and lay down. He curled his body tight, tucking his nose under his tail, and his coat blended into the shadow until he was nearly invisible. Garrett covered the space with a heavy dark blanket. He stepped back. From outside the truck there was nothing to see. No movement, no shape, no dog.